On a dark and stormy night, the group of friends decided to go on a hike in the woods. They had always enjoyed the thrill of exploring new places, and the eerie atmosphere of the forest only added to their excitement. As they walked deeper into the woods, they started to notice strange things. The trees seemed to be closing in on them, and they heard whispers on the wind that they couldn't quite make out. Their nerves were on edge, but they continued on. After a while, they came across an old abandoned cabin. It looked as if it hadn't been used in years, with the windows boarded up and the door hanging off its hinges. Despite their unease, they decided to investigate. As they entered the cabin, they were met with a sense of foreboding. The air was thick with dust and the floorboards creaked underfoot. Suddenly, they heard a noise coming from the basement. Curiosity got the better of them, and they descended the creaky stairs into the dark, musty cellar. As they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small room, filled with strange and ominous symbols on the walls. The room was cold, and they could hear a faint humming sound. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them, and they turned to see a hooded figure standing in the doorway. They froze, unsure of what to do. The figure slowly approached them, and they could see the glint of a knife in its hand. Just as they thought they were done for, the figure pulled off its hood to reveal that it was their friend, playing a prank on them. They all breathed a sigh of relief, laughing at how scared they had been. But as they turned to leave, they realized that the door to the cellar was now locked, trapping them inside. The room grew colder and darker, and the humming sound grew louder. They realized that their friend was not the one behind this, and that they were truly trapped. As they huddled together, they heard the faint sound of chanting coming from outside the door. They knew then that they were not alone, and that whatever was out there, it was not human. The unexpected twist was that the friends thought they had been pranked, but it turned out that they were actually trapped with something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. It was a warm summer evening, and Lily was walking home from her night shift at the local diner. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She looked around, but there was no one in sight. As she neared her apartment building, she heard a rustling noise behind her. She turned, but once again, there was no one there. Her heart racing, she quickened her pace and made it to her building. As she entered her apartment, she breathed a sigh of relief. She locked the door behind her and settled down on her couch to watch some TV. But as she sat there, she started to feel uneasy again. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Suddenly, she heard a scratching noise coming from the front door. She tried to ignore it, but it grew louder and more insistent. She got up to investigate, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the door, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her through the peephole. She screamed and stumbled backwards, falling onto the couch. The scratching continued, and the eyes grew closer. She realized then that whatever was on the other side of the door was not human. It was something dark and malevolent, something that wanted to do her harm. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the scratching stopped. She cautiously got up and peered through the peephole, but there was nothing there. She breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it had all been a hallucination. But as she turned around, she saw a shadowy figure looming over her. It had been inside the apartment all along, hiding in the shadows. She tried to scream, but it was too late. The figure lunged at her, and she knew that she was doomed. It was late at night, and Tom was closing up his vape shop for the evening. He was tired after a long day of work, but he was looking forward to going home and getting some rest. As he finished locking up the shop, he heard a noise coming from the alleyway behind the building. He turned to investigate, but before he could react, he was jumped by a group of masked men. The men were armed, and they demanded that Tom hand over all of the cash and valuables in the store. Tom tried to reason with them, but they were insistent. They had come to rob the store, and they weren't leaving without what they came for. As Tom handed over the cash register, he tried to think of a way out of the situation. But the men were too quick, and they had him cornered. He knew that he was in grave danger. Just as he thought he was done for, he saw a glimmer of hope. One of the men had dropped a flashlight, and it had rolled across the floor. In a desperate move, Tom lunged for the flashlight, grabbing it before the robbers could react. He swung the flashlight with all his might, hitting one of the robbers in the head. The man fell to the ground, unconscious. The others were momentarily stunned, and Tom took advantage of the opportunity to escape. He ran out of the store, sprinting down the street as fast as he could. He could hear the robbers chasing him, but he didn't look back. He knew that if he stopped, they would catch him. As he rounded the corner, he saw a police car parked on the street. He ran up to the officers, gasping for breath, and explained what had happened. The officers quickly apprehended the robbers, and Tom was relieved to be safe. But as he looked back at his store, he realized that it would never be the same. The fear and trauma of that night would stay with him forever. John had always been fascinated by the occult, and he spent many hours exploring old cemeteries and abandoned buildings in search of supernatural phenomena. One day, he stumbled upon a decrepit old tombstone that seemed to be emitting an eerie glow. Intrigued, he approached the tombstone to investigate. As he drew closer, he realized that the glow was coming from inside the tombstone. Without thinking, he reached out to touch it. But as soon as his fingers brushed the surface, he was engulfed in a blinding light. When he opened his eyes, he found himself trapped inside a tombstone. He could see the outside world, but he couldn't escape. He pounded on the walls, but they were solid and unyielding. As he sat there, trapped and alone, he realized that he wasn't alone after all. He could hear strange whispers and creaking noises coming from all around him. The tombstone was haunted, and he was trapped with the spirits of the dead. For days he sat there, desperate for help and a way to be freed. He screamed for help, but no one could hear him. He tried to pry the walls open with his bare hands, but it was no use. One night, as he sat there in the darkness, he heard a voice calling out to him. It was a woman's voice, soft and soothing. She promised to help him escape the tombstone, but only if he promised to serve her. Desperate for a way out, John agreed. The woman's voice grew louder, and suddenly, he felt a surge of power flowing through him. The walls of the tombstone crumbled, and he was free. But as he stepped out into the night, he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. The woman's voice was not benevolent, but malevolent. She had used him as a vessel, and now he was possessed by a dark force. After John realized that he was possessed by an evil spirit, he tried to fight it off, but the spirit was too strong, and it took control of his body and mind. He began to act strangely, talking to himself and having terrifying nightmares. He started to avoid people and stopped going to work. His friends and family noticed that something was wrong, but they didn't know what to do. As time went on, John's behavior grew more and more erratic. He would lash out at those around him, and his eyes had a dark, sinister look. It was as if he was no longer himself, but a vessel for the evil spirit that had possessed him. One night, John disappeared. His family and friends searched for him, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Weeks went by, and there was no sign of John. His loved ones feared the worst, and they mourned his loss. But then, one day, they received a message from John himself. The message was written in a strange, unknown language. But when it was translated, it revealed a chilling truth. John was no longer alive, at least not in the way they had known him. His body had been taken over by the evil spirit, and now he was trapped in the realm of the dead. The message warned that the spirit was still out there, seeking new vessels to possess. It was a chilling reminder that the world was full of dark forces, and that even those who sought to explore the supernatural could fall victim to their power. The fate of John serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that there are things beyond our understanding that we should approach with caution and respect. Emma had always been afraid of the dark. As a child, she would sleep with the lights on and would never venture out at night. But as she grew older, she tried to overcome her fear. She would take walks at night, hoping to desensitize herself to the darkness. One night, as she was walking through a deserted park, she heard a strange sound. It was a rustling in the bushes, like something was moving around. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes and looking disheveled. Emma tried to back away, but the man blocked her path. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse and trembling. "You have to help me. I'm lost, and I don't know where I am." Emma was scared, but she also felt a sense of compassion. She decided to help the man, and together, they started walking through the park. As they walked, Emma realized that the man was not leading her to safety, but deeper into the darkness. As they walked, Emma's fear grew stronger. She was certain that the man was going to harm her, but she couldn't escape. She tried to reason with him, to plead with him to let her go, but it was no use. Finally, they reached a clearing in the park. The man turned to Emma, his eyes glowing in the darkness. "You've been so kind," he said. "I'll make your death quick." Emma realized too late that the man was not lost, but a dangerous predator who had been waiting for a victim to prey upon. She screamed, but it was too late. The man attacked her, and Emma knew that she was going to die. But then, something unexpected happened. The man suddenly fell to the ground, convulsing in pain. Emma looked around and saw a figure standing in the shadows, holding a strange object. It was a hunter, who had been tracking the man for weeks. He had finally caught up with him and had saved Emma's life. Emma was shaken but grateful. She had survived an encounter with a dangerous predator, thanks to the intervention of a stranger in the night. She knew that she would never be able to fully overcome her fear of the dark, but she also knew that there were good people out there who were willing to protect the vulnerable. Emily had always been curious about the abandoned house at the end of her street. The house had been empty for as long as she could remember, and there were all sorts of rumors about why it had been abandoned. One night, Emily decided to investigate. She snuck out of her house and made her way to the abandoned house. As she walked through the overgrown garden, she felt a sense of unease. The front door was unlocked, and Emily pushed it open. The house was dark and musty, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. Emily's heart was pounding as she made her way through the house, searching for clues about why it had been abandoned. As she walked through one of the rooms, she heard a strange noise. It was a low, rumbling sound, like something was moving in the walls. Emily froze, her heart racing in her chest. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes and looking pale and ghostly. Emily screamed, but the woman did not seem to hear her. The woman walked towards Emily, her eyes fixed on something in the corner of the room. Emily looked in the direction of the woman's gaze, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a portrait of the woman, hanging on the wall. But it was not just any portrait, it was a portrait of Emily herself. Emily realized too late that she had stumbled into a haunted house, and that the ghostly woman was trying to warn her about something. But it was too late. The ghostly woman had disappeared, and Emily was trapped in the house. As she searched for a way out, Emily realized that the house was not just haunted by the ghost of the woman. It was also haunted by the spirits of all the people who had died there, victims of a terrible tragedy that had taken place years ago. Emily knew that she had to find a way out of the house, but the spirits were closing in on her. She could hear their voices, whispering in the darkness. Finally, Emily stumbled upon a hidden door, and she pushed it open. She saw a glimmer of light, and she realized that it was her way out. She ran through the door and into the night, her heart racing in her chest. As she looked back at the abandoned house, she saw the ghostly figures peering out at her from the windows. Emily knew that she had narrowly escaped with her life, and that she would never forget the terror of the haunted house at the end of her street. It was a dark and stormy night, and the only sound in the house was the ticking of the clock. Jenny had always been afraid of storms, and tonight was no exception. She huddled under her blankets, trying to block out the thunder and lightning. As she tried to fall asleep, she heard a strange sound coming from outside her window. It was a scratching sound, like something was trying to claw its way into her room. Jenny's heart was pounding in her chest as she slowly pulled back the covers and made her way towards the window. As she got closer, the scratching sound grew louder and more insistent. Finally, she reached the window and looked outside. What she saw made her scream. There, clinging to the side of the house, was a grotesque creature with twisted, gnarled limbs and glowing red eyes. It was trying to force its way into the house, using its sharp claws to scratch at the walls. Jenny knew that she had to do something. She stumbled backwards, trying to find something to defend herself with. As she rummaged through her room, the creature's scratching grew louder and more frantic. Finally, Jenny found what she was looking for, a large flashlight. She held it tightly in her hand as she made her way back to the window. As she shone the light outside, she saw that the creature was still there, its red eyes fixed on her. Jenny took a deep breath and aimed the flashlight directly at the creature's face. To her surprise, the creature let out a howl of pain and recoiled, falling from the side of the house and landing with a sickening thud on the ground below. Jenny breathed a sigh of relief and collapsed onto her bed. As she closed her eyes, she heard a voice whispering in her ear. "Thank you, Jenny," the voice said. "You have saved us all." Jenny's eyes flew open, and she realized that the creature outside her window was not a monster at all. It was a guardian spirit, protecting her from an even greater evil that lurked outside. As the storm raged on outside, Jenny felt a sense of gratitude for the strange and mysterious forces that had saved her life. She knew that she would never forget the terrifying night when she faced her fears and emerged victorious. Mark had always been an adventurer at heart, and there was no challenge he enjoyed more than climbing mountains. He had conquered some of the tallest peaks in the world, and he was always on the lookout for his next great adventure. One summer, Mark decided to take on the challenge of Mount Everest. It was the tallest peak in the world, and he knew that it would be a grueling climb, but he was confident in his abilities. As he began his ascent, Mark felt a sense of exhilaration that he had never experienced before. The climb was difficult, but he was making good progress. However, as he approached the summit, something strange began to happen. The air grew colder and the wind picked up, making it difficult to see. Mark felt a sense of unease creeping over him, and he began to wonder if he had made a mistake by attempting the climb. As he reached the summit, Mark was hit by a sudden gust of wind that nearly knocked him off his feet. He tried to steady himself, but he found that he couldn't move. It was as if something was holding him in place, keeping him from moving forward. Mark looked around, trying to see what was happening. That's when he saw it. A dark, shadowy figure was looming over him, blocking his path. Mark tried to run, but the figure seemed to follow him, always staying just out of reach. He was trapped on the summit, unable to move or escape. As the hours passed, Mark began to feel a sense of despair. He knew that he was trapped on the mountain, with no way to call for help or escape. The figure continued to haunt him, and he felt as though he was being consumed by its dark energy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was a rescue helicopter, sent to save him from his desperate situation. As he was airlifted to safety, Mark looked back at the mountain and saw the shadowy figure disappear into the mist. He knew that he had narrowly escaped with his life, and he would never forget the terrifying experience that he had endured. From that day on, Mark decided that he would stick to climbing smaller, less treacherous mountains. He knew that he had been lucky to survive, and he didn't want to push his luck any further. Alice had always been an adventurous person, but when she woke up in an underground labyrinth, she knew that she had gotten herself into something much more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. As she looked around, Alice realized that she was deep underground, surrounded by nothing but cold, damp walls. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. Alice tried to find her way out, but every path she took seemed to lead her deeper into the labyrinth. She tried to retrace her steps, but the walls all looked the same, and she quickly became disoriented. As she continued to wander through the labyrinth, Alice began to hear strange noises in the distance. She could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, and the faint whispers of something sinister. She tried to ignore the sounds and press on, but the deeper she went, the more she felt like she was being watched. Alice knew that she needed to find a way out, but every path seemed to lead to a dead end. After what felt like hours, Alice stumbled upon a strange room, lit by torches that flickered ominously. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, covered in strange symbols and markings. Alice tried to back away, but she found that she was unable to move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped by some unknown force. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a tall, dark figure that seemed to be made of pure darkness. Alice tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure approached her, its eyes glowing red in the dim light of the torches. Alice knew that she was trapped, with no hope of escape. Just when she thought all was lost, the figure suddenly vanished, and Alice found herself back in her own bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up, gasping for breath, and realized that it had all been a dream. But as she looked around her room, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a small, black stone, covered in the same strange symbols that she had seen in the labyrinth. Alice knew that she had never seen the stone before, but she also knew that it was somehow connected to the dream that she had just had. She tried to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her, but she knew that she would never forget the terrifying experience that she had just endured. Jenna had been working at the fast food restaurant for months, but she never thought that her job would turn into a nightmare. It was late at night, and the restaurant was nearly empty. Jenna was busy cleaning up, when she heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. At first, she thought that it was just the fryer making noise, but then she heard it again, a strange scratching sound. Jenna cautiously made her way into the kitchen, but everything looked normal. The fryer was still, the grill was off, and there was no one else in the restaurant. She tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over her, but she couldn't ignore the strange scratching sound that she had heard. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. It was a figure, lurking in the shadows, watching her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped out of the shadows, revealing a grotesque face that was twisted into a malicious grin. Jenna tried to run, but she found that she was rooted to the spot. The figure approached her, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. Jenna knew that she was in grave danger, but she couldn't move, trapped by some unknown force. Just when she thought that all was lost, the figure suddenly vanished, leaving Jenna alone in the kitchen. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over her, but she knew that she would never forget the terrifying experience that she had just endured. From that day on, Jenna was never quite the same. She always felt like something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Whenever she walked into the restaurant, she could feel the presence of the figure, lurking in the shadows. Jenna knew that she could never forget the terror that she had felt that night, and she knew that she would never be the same again.